Before we start using synthesizers, it's important to know the components involved in controlling them. Now, synthesizers are a big part of almost all music today. So it's really something worth knowing, and they can be a lot of fun to work with once you get started. We're going to look at these key components, and I'm going to give you a disclaimer out front. A lot of this stuff won't make much sense at first until you actually start to use it. So we're just going to go through this, kind of stick with it and try to absorb what you can. And then once you try out the exercise that follows this, it's not a bad idea to come back to this and review it, and it might make more sense again. But it's also important that we kind of get this out of the way in the beginning stages. So let's look at the key components that we're going to look at. All synthesizers, well, actually, there's different types of synthesizers. I'm speaking specifically about analog synthesizers right now. They all have something called an oscillator, and at least one. Some of them have more than one, some have two or three. And what they do is they actually generate the sound. So the definition of an oscillator is an electronic oscillator produces a periodic, back and forth electronic signal, often a sine wave or square wave. So basically what it really just does is it generates a sound. And the actual non-musical definition of oscillator is basically something going back and forth. So a filter is going to limit the frequencies of that initial sound. So the oscillator will generate a sound. And if you can think back of when I demonstrated on the piano how overtones get produced with a sound, the same thing happens with an oscillator. And what the filter does is you can actually filter out those frequencies. And again, this will make more sense when I demonstrate it. The next is the amp, and that basically just amplifies the sound and makes it louder or softer. But the amplifier also has four components that are very important to pay attention to. And those four components fit under the topic of what's called the envelope. And the envelope has four components to it. Some of them only have three, but for the most part, most synthesizers have the same. By the way, the good news about this is when you learn one synthesizer, you can really transfer the knowledge to another one. And I will show you the similarities in a later slide. Now, what they have is attack, sustain, decay, and release. So if you look at this image on the side, attack is going to be how fast the sound reaches its top point, its actual optimal point. Now, some instruments, let's go to instruments for a minute because synthesizers are imitating that a little bit. Something like a piano or a drum would have a very sharp attack. So you see this slope here? That would have a much more steep slope because when it hits it, the attack is the initial, the initial sound that you hear. So this one is fairly slow. So again, I will demonstrate this and you will hear this. So just stick with it. The decay is where it goes down to before it does what's called sustain. And so you can, the decay of a sound can be adjusted long or shorter. And then sustain is where it's its point of rest, where it's gonna go. So where it's gonna sustain to. And then the release is what happens when basically what you want to think of is what happens after the key is released. If you're using a keyboard to generate the sound, the release will be what happens after that. So something like a piano, where you're holding the sustain pedal on a piano, would have a very long release. But something like a piano where you're not holding the sustain pedal down and you release the key where it stops immediately would actually have a very short release, and it would actually be more vertical rather than diagonal, which is what we've got. And there's another component that many synthesizers have, which is called noise. And I'll demonstrate that when we look at it as well. And there's usually an oscillator that just generates what's called white noise, which is basically a static sound. And you might say, well, why would I want that? Well, it really can add to sounds when you start to play with it. One other component of synthesis, which is this one is definitely is one that is better understood when you hear it rather than this definition of it, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. The resonance is achieved by applying feedback to a filter, which basically means it's going to keep cycling the sound around over and over again. The effect is it will boost the frequencies around where you want it. Again, don't fight this and don't stress out about this definition. You will see it in action. As resonance increases, the feedback increases to a point that the filter can generate a sine wave tone. This is called self-oscillation. So just kind of look at that and digest it a bit. But again, this is one of those things, maybe when you come back and look at this presentation again after trying out the experiment, you will have a better sense of what it's actually doing. As I said earlier, many synthesizers have the same components. Now, what you're looking at on the top is the interface for one of the greatest synthesizers in the world, which is actually came out in the 60s and was developed a little more in the 70s, the Moog synthesizer. And the one on the bottom is actually the synthesizer that you're going to be working with in Soundtrap. Now, if you know, I color coded these. So if you see whatever's in red here, you're going to find the equivalent in the Soundtrap one. So in red here, what you've got here is my oscillators. Remember I said it's the component that generates the sound. And you can see that this has it here. If you notice, these knobs here allow you to pick different sound waves, which is something that most synthesizers do. And you can also see that in the Soundtrap version, it gives you a drop-down menu to do the same thing. Right now, you don't know about those sound waves, so don't worry about those. Next, we've got this yellow component here, which is our mixer, and this will allow that to mix. Now, basically, this one gives me a lot more to play with. However, this slider right here will basically blend the amount of oscillator 2 and oscillator 1. So as you move it down, you get more oscillator 2, and as you move it up, you get more oscillator 1. The good news is, when you start to do this, you just kind of move these things around until you get what you like. Okay, the next thing we have here is this purple section, which is called the filter. And the filter is a thing I talked about a little earlier. Now, they both have the same components, which is an attack, decay, release, and sustain. And there's also a resonance in here. In here, they call it a cutoff frequency, but it's the same thing. And here it's called resonance, but again, it's the same things are available. Now let's look at this greenish color here, which just basically can modify that. That gives us our attack and decay, sustain, and release. Now you're going to see that these are here twice. The difference is the attack on here will work within the sound, and this affects the entire sound. I will demonstrate when we go and start playing with it. And then the final thing are some extra kind of things that some synthesizers have and some don't. And this is called the LFO. And what that does is it affects the sound. It will affect the sound. It's actually another oscillator that's a very low frequency that will make the sound have like wavering effects. And this is where you can get some of those warbling effects and things like that you hear in a lot of EDM and techno music. It's one of the ways that it's done. And then, of course, you just have the overall volume of the synthesizer. So really, the whole concept of this slide is to show that when you learn this and you open this, you kind of know what to do from what you learned here when you get here. And the same goes for any other synth that we might open up and start playing with. So here we are in Soundtrap, and I've loaded in the synthesizer that I'm going to be sharing with you to do your project. And it's one that I created that has basically everything stripped out of it so you can start from scratch. So I'm going to click on this synthesizer to open it up. And first it'll just bring up my keyboard. That's fine. But what I want to do is I want to go to this button here called Tweak. And this will load in the synthesizer controls. So let's move some stuff around here. Okay, so here are my oscillators. And I'm going to hit a key, any key. I'm just using my mouse. We'll use this C4 as our listening key. And right now, I've only got one oscillator working. You see the second one? I can turn it on or off. Okay, so let's listen to the different waveforms. So the first thing you start with when you're creating a sound will be the waveforms. So here are my oscillators, and you can switch them. So, by the way, the interface for Soundtrap hasn't quite figured out how to make it work for the dark screen yet. So it's hard to see. But if you move your mouse off of it, here's noise. Remember I talked about noise? Okay, you can mix that in. Here's a saw wave. Here is a triangle wave. And here is a square wave. It has a hollow sound. So each sound has a different, or each wave has a different characteristic sound. And over time, you start to familiarize yourself with them the more you use them. The next step here is my mix. So if I were to have two oscillators on, let's turn on both. Let's put noise in the second one so we can see how that blends. So I've got a sine wave and I've got noise. Now let's look at how this mix works. Okay, you hear that noise? Okay, so if I go all the way here, it's going to be all noise. And if I go up here, it's going to be all sine wave. And if I want to blend them, you might want just a little noise in there. Okay, you can also, you can tune. So, but if I were to do this, let's say if I were working on, say, like a bass part, I could lower the sound. Okay, so you can just see how that works. And again, I'm going to demonstrate this more in detail. I just want to show you the features. The next is the filter. And this is where I want to start talking about various different types of things. Before I go to this filter, I want to go to this one, this envelope or the amplifier. Now, remember I talked about attack and decay? So let's listen to this. And notice that when I let go of the key, it stops immediately. And notice that when I press the key, it starts immediately. Now let's give it a slow attack. Hear how it fades in? And you can adjust that. So I'll split the difference. And if I want just a little bit of edge taken off the beginning of it, I can do that. So you can just move this up and down. Now, my decay is going to be where it lands before it sustains. So let's try this. Let me give a slow attack. Okay. You hear how it sort of peaks and then sort of settles into a spot? We're adjusting that with our decay. So let me slow my decay down. Okay, I'm going to take a little less noise in this. In fact, I'm shutting the noise off for now. Okay, so let's just put this in the middle at 50%. Now, if I take my release, watch what happens. Now, here, I'm going to move my mouse off the key deliberately so you can see. Now, if I lower my release back to where it was, when I release it, it doesn't. So if you want like a sort of a piano-y kind of sound, you want to bring your release up. So that's how the amplifier works. Now, the same controls are available in the actual sound itself, within the sound, but what these do is they affect within the sound. So you can have a separate attack where your sound starts, but if you want, you can adjust how the filter works. So let's work on the filter. Now, first thing you want to do with the filter is adjust its cutoff. Here's my cutoff wide open. And as I close it down, you're going to hear the top end filter off a lot. And a lot of times you really want to do that to get a smoother sound. It's kind of edgy up here, but you can do that. Now here's our resonance, which we talked about, and that's going to be the frequency where Notice, you hear how there's like a sharp spot it gets where you change it. Now, see, you can almost think of it as like an EQ, kind of. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but you can do that. And you can exaggerate how much or how little envelope is in it. I'm going to bring it up all the way. And let's slow down our attack here. So we're getting something kind of interesting here. And the last thing we want to look at is, I want to get a nice sustain for this, is the LFO. And the LFO, you can also assign waves to. Now, you actually never hear this. All it does is affect the sound. So I'm going to leave this on square. I'm going to put this on. I'm going to turn it on. And I'm just going to mess with the rate here. And if I lower the rate, and that's because, now see, it's affecting this because there's a square wave that is doing it. Now I'm going to show you diagrams of the different waves later, but now if I change this to another waveform, it's going to be a smoother one. The sine wave is more of a smoother wave. So if I were to take this down, and that's where you get your warbling effects, which is by increasing these. Now, if I can change my rate by, this makes it slower or faster as it, what we call, modulates the sound. And you can actually, there's a second one where you can have two of these. And of course, gain just lowers or raises the volume of the overall sound. So next, we'll program something.